It's as good as time as any to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to LaunchPad, the Jamf admin meetup hosted by Rocket Man. I think most people in this call know Robert. He's a man who needs no introduction, but he's getting one anyways. He's the principal Mac engineer at SAP, formerly of SpaceX. And in his own words, he's the dude from Slack who's always yelling at Apple. His words, not mine. Robert, we're super excited to have you. I don't want to steal any of your thunder, and I know that you've got a bit of an about me slide built in there. So if you've got the controls that you need, looks like you're sharing your screen, you are ready to launch.
So we'll talk a little bit about macOS 26, and just I actually hid my about me slide, but again, I've been a member of Slack for a number of years, and I'm traditionally the person who does a lot of these what's new in the new OS presentations, and I also spend a lot of time yelling at Eric Boyd and team about now I have to find somebody else to yell at regarding like, hey, we really need this fixed, or this really should be better, or so on in macOS. And we're starting to see some. We've seen a lot of these things appear over the years. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about macOS 26 Tahoe. It was introduced in June. Hopefully, you all spent a lot of time testing it and are ready to support it on day zero. It released what, about 3 weeks ago now, just shy of 3 weeks, on September 15th. And one of the big changes, of course, is now we have the same version number for everything. I was really good at, I was okay with, macOS 15 and iOS and iPadOS 18. And it's like, what's the version of watchOS? Is it 11? I can't remember. And then tvOS, I couldn't remember. And, visionOS 2.0. So it's nice that everything is now unified. It also tells us that we have a number scheme going forward. Apple has documentation that's pointed out that next version will be macOS 27. So it also makes my job as far as doing these presentation proposals for things like Penn State easier, because I know what the version number is going to be, not have to guess. Like I had to change it this year. And again, you think of it like the auto industry. The 2026 models usually come out in the fall of 2025. And it is also ironic that the first OS version that Apple did this with is also a car, a 26. So does that mean we're going to see like, macOS 27 Yukon and macOS 28 Escalade? I don't know. But so we've already seen one bug fix release, mostly security fixes, but there was also a fix for an issue that it prevented installation on certain Mac Studio computers. So that dropped on Monday. And 26.1 is in beta. It has some interesting changes. It has some performance optimizations. Recommend getting on the beta, at least on your own machine, so that you're not surprised by anything. It's expected that you'll see 26.1 release by the end of October. That doesn't mean Apple may not come out with a 26.02 or 03 if there's a need to, but the first bug fix version will be 26.1. And after that, we see these betas every 2 weeks. So the beta for 26.1 came out a couple of Tuesdays ago. So I would fully anticipate that next week, Tuesday, we will see, beta 2 of 26.1. And after that, about every 45 to 60 days, we'll see another point release, another major point release, as opposed to a minor one like 26.01, 26.1, 26.2, and so on. Talk a little bit about hardware requirements. Basically, any Apple Silicon Mac and a very limited subset of Intel Mac. These Intel Macs, the one thing that they all have is a secure enclave processor. Number of machines which supported macOS 15 Sequoia are no longer supported. And Apple has made it very clear, but to answer a question that everybody always has every year around new OS time, how long will Intel be supported? Well, macOS 26 is it. So what does that mean for you, as an endpoint administrator? You should probably inventory the number of Intel Macs in your organization and come up with a plan to replace them over the next 12 to 15 months. In addition, Apple has said that the Rosetta 2 emulation software, which is used to run Intel native software on Apple Silicon Macs, will stop being supported as of after macOS 27, so macOS 28. So we still have another year and a half approximately of Intel support. So this means you need to inventory your software. You might think to yourself, well, I think everything we have is actually supported. Well, there's a couple of different tools you can use to highlight what Intel software may be available on your system. The first one is the good old system information utility, available in the applications folder or option about this Mac. If you click on software and then applications, you can sort by what processor is supported. Apple Silicon, Intel, Universal. You can also use Apple's Mac Evaluation Utility app. You get that from the Appleseed from IT portal. This is a screenshot here from my own machine here of of software, and it's sorted by what is Intel only. So you see, I've got some fax drivers and some raster defects as part of HP printer drivers that are not Intel native. There's also an app called Forescout Secure Connector for Ethernet authentication that was not Apple Silicon native, and the YubiKey Manager, which there's a replacement for that. So there's like 2 or 3 things in my organization that we have to address in this time. And similarly, you can run Mac Evaluation Utility, and it'll have this section for non-universal applications, and it'll show some of the apps like the YubiKey Manager and so on that are not supported. I couldn't resist throwing in a couple of memes about the new liquid glass interface. It's a love it or hate it thing. Personally, I don't mind it. A lot of people don't like it. Some people like it. It's a little buggy at times. There's some weird things with like password entry and so on. These are things that'll get fixed. If anybody lived through the, great iOS 8 redesign multiple years ago, we kept seeing every new release fixed a bunch of GUI issues with the thing. So I don't let myself get myself worked up over GUIs and GUI issues. Another useful meme here. So what we're here to talk about is mainly enterprise features. No, not that enterprise. So the biggest one in macOS 26 is the MDM migration feature. If you migrated MDMs before, you had no choice but to wipe and re-enroll your devices. So this is a new feature that, this is one of the core features that Apple has highlighted in macOS 26. It allows you to use Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, also known as AXM, to establish a target date or deadline. And if the deadline passes, the migration is forced. If you don't establish deadline, of course, nothing happens. The device doesn't migrate. Now, think about these things. Let's say you've got devices in one MDM and you've deployed a Wi-Fi profile to get them on your corporate network. What do you think happens when you do this migration? That device is going to fall off the corporate network once the old MDM profile and the Wi-Fi profile are removed. So you have to have a test that workflow. The second thing is if you use volume purchase program apps on macOS, they are not preserved between MDMs. So if you use MDMA and deploy a bunch of VPP apps to your Mac or your iOS and iPadOS device, you and switch MDMs, since the new MDM doesn't basically have any knowledge or ownership of those apps, so they will not be updated. So you need to take that into account. In general, I try to avoid VPP apps on macOS because there's a lot of issues with it. But okay, so this is a video, and I'm going to qualify the fact that I put the video in here, but I never watched it. So let's see the MDM migration. So you see it's unenrolling, and there is a prompt there to pick a Wi-Fi network if you happen to fall off the one. So, if you may need like a guest network or something to be able to connect to during this process. Now it's enrolling the new one. And installing payloads, profiles, and payloads. Now, do note there will be some circumstances where you cannot use the migration if you've done something like you've used recovery lock to escrow a recovery password in Jamf Pro to basically prevent somebody from booting into recovery on an Apple Silicon Mac. There's no way to migrate with that. You have to wipe the device. Has anyone used the MDM migration feature or tested it?
I have.
How well did it work for you?
Well, you see the video now.
Okay, yeah. Oh,
It,
okay, yeah.
it worked great. This was moving from Jamf Now to Jamf Pro, and I was surprised by how well it worked. The one thing I'll say is it does need to be enrolled in Apple Business Manager, right? Initially.
Right.
So if it was enrolled manually, this isn't going to work.
Yeah. Yep, there are some caveats to these things, and that is definitely one of them.
Did you run into issues with escrowing the recovery key to the new MDM?
There's a feature in macOS 26 that handles that, which we'll talk about literally in a minute.
Oh, I tend to do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's
Foreshadowing. That we ran into an issue. We have a QA instance and a production instance, and we were playing with this, and we ran into an issue where we couldn't get the recovery key.
okay. So before we talk about that, we'll talk a little bit about a couple things that have been pain points for Apple device administrators, at least Mac administrators, for years, and that's the concept of secure tokens and bootstrap token. So a secure token is a cryptographic attribute associated with your user account that lets you unlock a volume. It also lets you do things like upgrade software on a machine. You don't necessarily have to be an admin to install software updates. And then a bootstrap token is a special key that can be granted or escrowed into an MDM that would allow that MDM to then give secure tokens to other users on the system. So, you may create, the first, and there's been some pain points around what users get a secure token. Does the bootstrap token get escrowed into MDM? In theory, if it is, someone should be able to log in and be granted a secure token by the MDM when they log in if they don't have one. The bootstrap token is also essential if you're going to use the declarative software updates, like in the update enforcement deadlines, where the MDM is basically sending the upgrade commands and needs that cryptographic attribute to be able to install the software updates or unlock the volumes. So a couple of changes in macOS 26. The first one is that the bootstrap token is now generated before any user exists on the system, because there were edge cases where that bootstrap token may not be generated until after users created, and it may not get escrowed into your MDM. And again, workflows or scripts that depend on the old behavior of the first user getting a secure token. You should probably make sure that your scripts work the way you expect them to on macOS 26. But as mentioned earlier in the question, file vault key escrow is a real pain point for a lot of admins. If somebody has a device they've manually enrolled and they go through a setup system, they'll be prompted to enable file vault before they enroll it. So the device will be encrypted and it'll have a recovery key. And then you enroll the device into your MDM. Is that recovery key escrowed? No, it isn't. Not until the user rotates it. So you have to, there's other scenarios too. If somebody re-enrolls their device in MDM, say the MDM profile is flagged to be removable, that secure token can be lost. Migrating MDMs, this is the reason why this feature exists, and then various bugs. So, I have smart groups in Jamf Pro that tell me, I have two different smart groups. One is the file vault key that's escrowed isn't valid. Another one where the key isn't escrowed. So there's a couple of ways you can handle it. There's a tool from Elliot Jordan of Netflix, and he did a JNUC presentation, I think it was 2023, at the JNUC conference in Austin on it. And ironically, during the session, I actually implemented it. And basically, it's one of those things where you set it up and forget it. You have those smart groups of devices that don't have it. You deploy Escrow Buddy, which is a login agent plugin. The next time the user logs in, the login agent plugin basically hooks into the authentication process and rotates the file vault key, which then causes it to be escrowed. The user never sees a dialog, never knows it exists. So it's like a very seamless approach. Another company out of Poland, and there are links in the chat, or links will be on the resources page, has a tool called Bootstrap Buddy, which will address this, for bootstrap tokens not escrowed. And the key part here is macOS 26 will automatically rotate the file vault key if the profile is removed and then reinstalled. So if you have that situation where the key isn't valid, you can simply descope and rescope that file vault encryption policy to force the rotation on the back end without leveraging a tool like Escrow Buddy. And again, this feature exists because of the pain point of migrating from one MDM to another, where your new MDM does not have the file vault key escrowed. So, and again, links to Escrow Buddy and Bootstrap Buddy. Again, these are very much set it and forget it type of things. It's like one of those things where you just look at it and say, oh, this is fixed with like 200 file vault keys in the last 3 months. Some more changes in macOS 26. There is a new file vault skip key in the pre-stage. If you go through the consumer experience, it'll actually it actually, and the 6 colors link here below explains the consumer experience more. It used to be that your file vault recovery key was stored in iCloud. Now it's no longer done that way. So it'll actually display your file vault key during the setup assistant if you have file vault configured to do that, or you enroll a device manually. So if you set the skip key, that is not presented. And that's a feature that's built into Jamf Pro 11.20, which is the first version that supports macOS 26. Rich Troughton also has a blog explaining more details on it and a profile that he has built to suppress that key. One interesting, unexpected feature. How many people have run a Mac as a server of some kind? It might be a caching server or just something that just sits and does something on your network. And maybe that device is on somebody's desk, or maybe it's actually like in a network closet or a data center. So do you want that volume encrypted? Probably not before macOS 26, because what would happen, let's say there was a power outage or the Mac got rebooted or it crashed or whatever. What happens when you reboot an encrypted Mac? It sits at the file vault preboot screen. Now I can just VNC it and fix it, right? No, I can't. So basically, if it was at a data center, for example, somebody would have to go in with a crash cart and connect a keyboard and display, be able to type the password in, and so the machine would boot up. So usually most people didn't encrypt Mac servers of any kind. So now with macOS 26, you can, when that Mac is at the file vault preboot window, it actually should be on your network. So you can use SSH to go in and authenticate and unlock the disk with a user account that, of course, has a secure token. Now, the caveat here is if you're using things like SSH keys or smart cards, that won't work. It has to be a username password combination. So let's pivot now to talk about platform SSO. The rule of thumb with Apple is when they introduce a new feature or a new technology, it usually takes them 3 OS releases to get it right. We kind of saw that a little bit with APFS. We saw various other technologies. The interesting thing with platform SSO is we're now in the 4th iteration of macOS 26. But it has some nice improvements. The biggest one that people have been asking for is being able to leverage platform and SSO at Setup Assistant through automated device enrollment. That feature exists today. It does require both your MDM and your identity provider to support it. So for example, Jamf has added support in Jamf Pro 11.20 for this. But if you're using Microsoft as your identity provider, Azure, Entra, you need to wait for Microsoft to do this, which they are working on, but it may be another month or 2 before it's available. And I can't speak to Google or Okta or anything like that. But so with Platform SSO, your local account is created on the fly, and you can also have it optionally sign into a managed Apple account, but you have to make sure the iCloud setup pane is not skipped in the skip keys. So there's 2 different methods of authentication with Platform SSO. The one that a lot of people think they want to default to is password sync. So basically, I would log into or unlock my Mac using the same password as my identity provider had. That's the way, for example, that Kerberos SSO works. That's the way other identity providers work. The approach that both Apple and Microsoft are pushing extensively is to use the secure enclave back method. So the advantage is here that it's more secure, and the disadvantage here is that there is no way to have that secure enclave-backed identity and a password sync as well. So you need to have a different password for the Mac than your identity provider. So the actual recommendation from Apple is rather than use a password, use a passcode. So you treat your Mac just like an iPhone or an iPad, where you have a 6 to 10-digit passcode that you use to authenticate. Because people still, I see a lot of tickets for people forgetting passwords and having to ask them for their file vault keys so they can reset their local password and whatever. When you do this too, of course, you get the bonus that whatever your photo is that's in your identity provider gets synced to your local user account. Platform SSO also supports authenticated guest mode. So as long as that device is online, it can reach your identity provider. You can log in with the credentials from that identity provider. The caveat here is that all data and files are deleted at logout. So this is not a complete solution for like lab environments where you might want to keep those files around. There's also some features, and I did see that one of the JNUC presentations that from other people who've participated here, I'm going to talk about using employee badge and iPhone to be able to tap to log in with a USB badge reader. So you'll be able to log into the computer, with your phone and your badge. You still have the caveat that your files are going to be deleted at logout. So the question is does this what does this do with 80 binding? If you're still binding in 80 here in 2025, you should probably look to see what alternatives you have. I can't say this with certainty, but Apple has wanted to kill 80 binding for a long time because the traditional thing was every new major macOS release, 80 binding was broken and it would took like some future version to get fixed. So they would really like to move away from mobile accounts and 80 binding. There's just so many pain points associated with them. But again, in lab and other type multi-user environments, they're kind of still useful. But you should probably be looking for alternatives. And since platform SSO and extensible SSO, Cloud Kerberos, basically replace Kerberos SSO, that is now deprecated. So if you're using local accounts in Kerberos SSO to synchronize passwords with an on-premise identity provider, you probably want to look to, PSSO and a cloud identity provider. This is a question I don't really have a good answer for. I'm not a Jamf Connect user. But what does platform SSO mean for Jamf Connect? Well, this is something you're going to want to test platform SSO and see what when the account creation and setup assist is available with your identity provider. You're going to want to test tap to login and guest login. But keep in mind that caveat that if files are deleted at logout, that may not be desirable. I think Apple is assuming that people are using some kind of cloud file provider like OneDrive or Google Drive, but not everyone is. And the disadvantage of using those cloud providers is, if I'm logging into a lab environment and I've got a lot of files on my OneDrive, it's going to take a lot of bandwidth to pull the data down. So I wouldn't say Jamf Connect is a dead or dying product, but you should definitely take a look at platform SSO and see if it suits your needs or if Jamf Connect is still a better approach solution for you. Some interesting new prompts. It wouldn't be a new version of macOS without some additional prompts for things that administrators would like to suppress and may or may not be able to suppress. The biggest one in macOS 26 is you will see sometimes dialogues for applications running in the background. And we'll talk about why that might be important in a little bit. But the controls exist to suppress these. They use the background task management controls that you probably were familiar with if you had to deploy macOS 13, which was the version where in the first beta, you figured out, hey, I can go into login items and I can turn off like Jamf and other things. This is not good. And where Apple had to scramble to give give administrators the ability to stop people from doing that. And there were basically 4 controls. You could identify the team identifier, which is like an application signature using the developer's certificate from Apple. The label, what the bundle ID is of the thing, or label prefix like com.apple. I usually don't recommend that. So these same controls can be used to suppress the background task management prompts. This is usually a new macOS release is always a good time for you to go through and look at what your prompts you're suppressing and what things you're in system settings, general login items. Is there anything in there that users can turn off that they shouldn't be able to? I know I've had that in my previous role where we changed a security tool and I still had the background task management for the old tool, but I hadn't created one for the new tool. So I had to audit this. So every new OS beta cycle and release time is a good time to go through and address these things. So you can run the sudo sfl tool dump btm command. This is a command line tool that'll give you information about all the launch agents and launch daemons. Something new with macOS 26 is you can only really use team identifier or bundle identifier to suppress these background task notifications. Label and label prefix don't work. So, before Apple hadn't given anybody any guidance on which one of these you should use, any of this should work. Now we're getting more specific that you should use this one or that one. So if you're not using team identifier or bundle identifier background task management controls, you probably should. So let's talk a little bit about why that may be important. Why do we care about processes running in the background? Well, they could be consuming CPU time. They could be generating heat. They could be consuming battery. Well, Apple Silicon Macs are great on battery. So why do I care? Well, what if Apple is going to make a lower end Mac, like a MacBook that would be less expensive than a MacBook Air, that would have a slower processor and a smaller battery. So my gut feel is that we will see something like this come up in the next 3 to 6 months. There'll be a lower cost Mac, which of course may be good news for enterprise if it's powerful enough to run Microsoft Office. Some more big changes around device management. How many people lived through the days when you checked for updates on your Mac and you couldn't find them? And you had to kickstart your software update daemon. People were doing it so often that Apple had to basically prevent the OS from being able to do that. There were numerous bugs with software update. Apple fixed them, but things are a lot more reliable these days. But in the process of doing this, Apple discovered that a lot of the MDM controls for managing software updates really kind of sucked. So Apple has been slow, since I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago now, they introduced declarative device management, which is kind of the successor to MDM. So what's the difference? Well, you got to think about time frame. MDM, the origins of MDM came around, how do we manage iPhones? Like when the first iPhone came out in 2008, 2009. So in those days, your phone had very limited power and battery life, and servers, by comparison, were powerful and had a lot of controls. So, the way the whole system was architected was that the client was dumb and the server was smart. So all the actions had to be, all the client would do is say, hey, you got it for me? And the server would say, yes, I do. And the server would query the client and then say, oh, you don't have this profile, let me push it to you, and things like that, or various settings. Been a lot of drawbacks to that. And obviously since 2008, the whole system has changed to where, these mobile devices are very powerful as are our computers. So the idea behind declarative device management is that the clients are more powerful and the server just acts as kind of a clearinghouse. So one of the big changes that Apple made in macOS 26 is they have deprecated the controls for software update, the MDM controls, one where you control about automatic install, automatic download, automatic install of updates, that sort of stuff. In a future version of macOS, we presume it's macOS 27, but Apple hasn't been real clear on that. They just said next year. So it could be one of those surprise 26.3 or 26.4 things, where they are going to change these controls over to declarative and not support MDM. So obviously you have to make sure your MDM vendor supports declarative device management, which most do, but there are some on-premise solutions that do not and will not. And if you're in one of those situations where you run your own Jamf Pro server, for example, you will not have declarative. You will not be able to manage software update settings. So that probably means you either need to migrate to a cloud-based MDM or migrate to a different MDM. Some resources on that. Rich Troughton has a PSU Mac 2025 presentation on MDM and DDM, and I think he's doing another one on DDM at JNUC, but I'm not certain. There's also the DDM Explorer app from Jamf, which is in the App Store. Kind of a pain that you have to go to the App Store for it. And of course, there's Apple documentation link on declarative, the introduction to declarative device management. It's really a paradigm shift in device management, and I would fully expect you'll see Apple over the next, 2 or 3 years migrate virtually all the controls from MDM to DDM. So some of the new controls that exist in macOS 26 as well is better controls for Safari management. It's still not to the level of things you can do with like Chrome or Edge, but you can more easily do things like deploy default bookmarks or home pages, and controls over whether the user can actually like clear their browser history or use private browsing or pop-up control or use Apple Intelligence. Like I said, there are some things that I have used before to manage in Chrome and Edge where you can have, when a website prompts for a certificate, I can build logic to an MDM profile for Chrome that would have it just pick the search for a cert based on these criteria, subject name, issue, or whatever, and have it pick so the user never is prompted. And that stuff doesn't exist in Safari management. Remember that comment about it takes Apple 3 iterations to get something right? Well, we're in version 1 of Safari management. Something else to keep in mind, I don't know how many people really know there's 2 different channels for MDM on macOS, and this only exists on macOS. It doesn't exist on iOS and iPadOS. You can actually deploy profiles as system level or user level. Try to avoid the user level ones. That adds a lot of complexity to things where you push a cert that goes in a user's login keychain instead of the system keychain. There can only be one MDM enabled user on your system, and it can possibly be not the user who's using the system. So that causes all kinds of problems. And it's one of those things that I think Apple's going to deprecate at some point, but If you can avoid user channel MDM on macOS, you probably should. Some changes, declarative app management, where in theory, you could do some management of apps, whether they come from the App Store or a package or a custom app or VPP apps. You can enforce, disable, and set automatic updates. This kind of calls back to a change that Apple made but didn't document in macOS 15, where if you used VPP apps on macOS, they would no longer update from your MDM if the apps were open, but the user was never presented with any information that there was a pending update, which leads to the question of like, why are 25% of the Outlook versions on our fleet like 5 versions out of date? Oh, that's why. So again, that's another reason why a lot of organizations have moved away from VPP apps. There's also a feature for iOS and iPadOS called App Management, which is kind of the successor. If you use App Config on iOS to like deploy a profile to a device to configure an app, there's this new App Management which basically replaces App Config, and you can run it. I have run this before in iOS where the app got on the system before the profile with the app config settings did. So one of the things that the new app management framework does is helps you avoid race conditions like that. Everything gets delivered in a single workflow. So the app can never be launched without the profile or the cert or whatever is needed with it. But this is not available for macOS yet. I'm hopeful this is something that makes it to macOS 27. So initially, Apple said, hey, there are no new management keys for Apple Intelligence. And it's like, well, actually, there is a new one for Xcode 26. It's the coding assistant allow external integrations. So, and I assume Jerome is going to talk about this at JNUC. So one other nice thing is, with macOS 15, if you had keys deployed to block or profiles deployed to block Apple Intelligence, people would still get ready for Apple Intelligence. And then they would get an error when they tried to turn it on. So that's now not suppressed by default. So again, little nice cleanup. There's also some new privacy protecting network content filtering solutions in macOS 26. So if you're using a kind of content filter, you want to find out if the vendor is supporting them. A few other miscellaneous changes. There's a new recovery assistant that pops up when you are running into issues booting from macOS. There's a new virtualization framework option. The previous let you virtualize other, Macs environments or Windows. Now you can do Linux container-like ones. Since there's also that option for virtualization, there's a new sparse image format that, rather than when you create a disk image, for example, it asks you the size. I want a, 1 gig file. It's going to take up that full space. The sparse image format will only take up the space that's actually used, and it'll of course grow, but you have to pre-declare how much space you're going to use on it. Back in the days of macOS 10.15, Apple announced that things like Ruby and Perl were deprecated, and Python 2, which they did remove in macOS 12.3. Ruby and Perl are still deprecated, but still present. Again, deprecated, just because the word deprecate is there doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means that this is going to go away. And if you're dependent upon having this, you need to figure out what your plan is. Similarly, in the 10.15 release, Apple announced that the CUPS, the Common Unix Printing System, the PPDs would go away. And again, they're still deprecated, but they still work. But if you're buying or doing anything with printers, you really want AirPrint compatible printers so you can print with macOS devices. And I think it was macOS 10.14 where Apple said the Audit logging framework, which a lot of people in regulated industries depend on, is going away, and it was disabled by default. It's still deprecated, but it still works. You can enable it. So if you use a product like Jamf Protect offline mode or Jamf Protect to send logs to a seam, part of that is turning that back on across your fleet. Apple did announce some new features with Apple Business and School Manager. The biggest one is an API, an application programming interface. How many people have asked for this? I could use the Jamf API to automate the processes and things, but I can't do anything with Apple Business Manager. Somebody has to go into the GUI and release devices or whatnot. So an administrator has to create this API account. So you can do assignment, unassignment, for your MDM migration or whatnot. And I've included a link here. Karthikeyan Marapan has created a set of auth, scripts that explain how authentication works with this. Some new restrictions around managed Apple accounts. These are not MDM controls. These controls actually exist in Apple Business Manager. You have to have the right role. Last year, they added a control where if you federate your domain with Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager, do you want those managed Apple accounts to be able to log in on a personal device? This year, they added the control so you can say that on managed devices, you can only sign in with a managed Apple account. That sounds like a great restriction to have, except when you find the areas where things you need to do with managed Apple accounts that you can't. And I'll give you an example. I have a corporate iPhone. I can use self-service to go and install apps, but it'll say I need an app that's not in self-service. So I'll sign into the App Store. Well, guess what? You can't do any e-commerce with a managed Apple account. So I have to sign with a personal Apple account. Or what if you're using things like Test Flight to test versions of apps? That Apple account can't be a managed Apple account today. So the problem we have here is that the setting in Apple Business or Apple School Manager to restrict the device setting is a global on-off for your whole organization. You cannot have exemptions. So this is feedback that I've filed to Apple saying this is not granular enough. I need the ability to allow some people to sign into devices, or I need the ability to be able to do e-commerce with managed Apple accounts, which, from what I understand, is more of a technical and legal limitation than or a tax or legal limitation than a technical one. A slight change that sounds better than it actually is. If you've gone through the federation process with Apple Business or School Manager, Apple used to tell you, oh, there's 3,000 accounts that have your domain.com address, but they wouldn't tell you who they were. So you had to be creative about how you figured out who these people were. Sometime this fall, you'll be able to obtain a list of existing Apple accounts during the process of federation. However, that list only encompasses people who have logged into specific services like a developer program or enterprise use cases. If I'm signed into it, if I've created an Apple account and I'm just using it for like Apple Music, that's not going to show up in this list. So it's somewhat better, but it's still not ideal. And Apple does have, when you do the federation process, users are given the option to, do you want to convert this Apple account to a managed account, which if you've done any kind of e-commerce with it, you probably don't, or do you want to just change it to be a personal account? There are some additional controls about what people can do who are, device enrollment manager. Can they remove activation lock? Can they release devices? Some more granular controls there. And for Apple School Manager, there are some controls over what a site manager can or cannot do. You can turn things off or turn them back on. Coming this fall will be device warranty information. This is fundamentally, if you've ever had to do the GSX integration with Jamf Pro and what a pain in the butt it is, this will eventually replace this. But this, of course, will require the MDM, Apple to release it, number one, and Jamf to support it. For iOS and iPadOS devices, they recently added the IMEI and EID. So, so you'll be able to get this information if you need to provision cellular service or eSIMs on devices. Now you'll be able to get Wi-Fi and Bluetooth MAC addresses out of Apple Business Manager. Some links, again, they're on the web page for this, so don't feel like you need to write these down. The Apple Device Manager GitHub is particularly useful if you're trying to find what's the key that does this. So let's talk a little bit about Jamf Pro and macOS Tahoe. Woohoo! Look at that AI generated image. So Jamf Pro, continuing, I think it was a 14-year tradition, has supported macOS, the new OSs on day zero. So Jamf Pro 11.2.0 was the first version that supports macOS 26 and all the other new 26 OSs. And subsequently, Jamf has released Jamf Pro 11.2.1, which has one additional skip key for macOS. So this gets into my, what should you do? So this is new OS time is always a really good time to take a snapshot of your environment. What do you do? What are we doing? Document things like what's my naming convention, for policy, smart groups, whatever. Am I consistent with that? The biggest one is to make a run book of what happens when you enroll a device. And this can be automated device enrollment or user initiated enrollment. What's the workflow like? What gets installed? What profile should be up on the device? And then you're going to want to test the macOS 26 system. Ideally, you're doing this before the OS releases, but if you haven't gotten around to it, you need to do that now, because you may find issues with scoping or something like that. As I mentioned previously, there are a number of new skip keys for additional privacy settings and File Vault, which are in Jamf Pro 11.20, and OS Showcase, which is in 11.21. So you may want to go edit that pre-stage and suppress these new screens. Let's talk a little about File Vault during Setup Assistant. This is really actually a really good experience, at least for automated device enrollment. Obviously, this does not apply to to manual device enrollment because the user runs Setup Assistant before enrolling device. So recommend you turn this on, and you should also include your whatever profile, it's your security and privacy or restrictions, or you have a separate encryption one, should include that in your pre-stage. Normally, when your pre-stages, you should limit the number of devices of profiles you insist be installed, but in this particular case, you want to make sure this ends up on the device immediately after enrollment before the user actually does anything. If you do enable File Vault during Setup Assistant, you should also test this workflow on a non-user initiated enrollment. When I deploy a profile to the device, user enrolled device, File Vault's already enabled, the key is already generated. Does that cause the key to get re-escrowed in Jamf or not? Another common mistake. How many people have smart groups in like macOS 13, macOS 14, macOS 15, and they target a lot of their profiles to these groups, or maybe even its exclusions? So what happens when macOS 26 comes out? Those devices don't get those profiles. So probably change that approach more to a scope to all and exclude like older versions that don't support it. But this is a very common error with new OS time when the version number increments. Another thing to do is check your restrictions profiles. There are multiple new keys for the new OSs. They're documented in the Jamf release notes. It's always a good time this time of year to go through your restrictions profiles and make sure that you are setting the settings you want to set and you're not setting the ones you don't, and that the new ones you've defined a value for. Yes, I want to manage this, or I don't care to manage this.
Robert, I'm just gonna quickly mention for the room, we're gonna keep humming. We've got Robert Hammen here. He's got a lot of great information, so we're gonna go late. If you do have to leave, we'll be posting the recording on our in the follow-up resources that Chris has posted in the chat, along with on our YouTube channel. So if you have to leave, thank you so much for coming. We're great to have you, but we're gonna keep humming here.
Yeah, and we're nearly done. So one thing to keep in mind is this has been this way forever with MDM. Let's say that there's a new preference key for macOS 26 that sets X. And you say, this is a great idea. I want to set this on all my devices. So you create a profile and you deploy it to all your devices in the organization, most of which are not running 26 yet. What happens when that Mac is upgraded to 26? Is that profile respected? No, because the preferences set in a profile are only evaluated when the profile is installed. So it's not reevaluated when the OS upgrade happens. So if there's a preference key in particular you're trying to set for macOS 26, you have to scope it only. You may create a profile for that key and scope it only to macOS 26 systems, rather than have like a combination profile. And again, this is one of the problems that DDM solves. Another thing is, and this is just reiterating a point that I mentioned earlier, check your system settings, general login items, extensions. What on a stock macOS 26 system, what can a user turn off that they shouldn't be able to, and then create a new background task management profile to prevent that from happening. And that is the end of my formal presentation.
Yeah, that was great. Robert, thank you so much for joining and presenting and sharing your knowledge with us. I can catch the vibe from the chat that everyone was really enjoying that. So we really appreciate it. That was a great presentation.
Thank you for joining us today. We have new episodes on the first Friday of every month. If you'd like to join our session live, visit the link in the description to get on our mailing list. And if you're looking to get the most out of your Jamf server, visit rocketman.tech to set up a meeting with one of our Jamf experts. That's rocketman.tech.